everybody knows St. Patrick has two guardian angels, by the way. Maybe the rest of us only rate the one, but Patrick of Ireland, the salmon of heaven, as he's called, he has two guardian angels. And so he's sitting there and he's listening to basically the last Irish hero or the last Irish giant. And he saw these guys, there's two of them. He saw them coming towards him like with a cloud of demons over them. So
Whoa.
that like he baptizes them and all the demons go away. And then they sit down to have dinner. And he says, tell me about like what was the greatest horse you ever saw, or who had the best hounds back in the old days, and all these different things. And then at some point, Patrick is like, maybe it's not good for me to think about these things because it's keeping me from prayer.
Uh-huh.
And so he prays about this, and his guardian angels come to him, and they basically tell him something to the effect of, it's okay. All of the stuff in this that's harmful is going to be forgotten.
Wow.
Like when it comes into contact with Christianity, the stuff in paganism that's like harmful or is detrimental, it's going to be sort of like it'll be left behind.
Mm.
But the stuff of the remnant, and again, this is what the main idea in Irish universal history is, the idea of the remnant from whatever came before, like
Yeah.
from before the flood, from the previous civilization, right? And the way that that remnant carries forward, and it carries forward through the medium of story.
This is Jonathan Pajot. Welcome to the Symbolic World.
Hello, everyone. I am back here with another episode of Universal History with Richard Rohlin. As you know, we have just wrapped up our Dante class. It was an amazing.
I just have to say Dante's Inferno class.
Yes,
Like
of
if we
course, because
say
there are going to be
Dante class,
more.
it's not like we did the whole thing, which we
No,
definitely did not. But yeah,
we spent six
fine.
3-hour treks, five
Yeah.
3-hour treks through the Inferno. It was amazing for me, discovering all kinds of things that I had forgotten that I didn't realize was there. It was just great, and we're looking forward to also doing purgatory and heaven and paradise. So,
Yeah.
but now today we are here to talk about Ireland.
So people have been asking for a long time, when are you going to do the universal history of Ireland? And to be totally honest, I've been scared of it and putting it off. The reason I am scared of it is that when you bring Ireland into the conversation, people go a little crazy. I mean, really, specifically Americans go a little crazy. There's this sort of I don't know, like, does everybody turn Irish on St. Patrick's Day in Quebec? I'm gonna assume no.
No, we don't. We
You
have
don't
English
like turn
speaking
your local
sections have
river,
that.
you don't turn your local river green or
No, we
anything.
don't. We don't. Yeah, we
Because
don't.
they do that in Chicago, like and in some other places, like they just pour a ton of green dye. I don't know what the long-term environmental consequences of that are. I'm sure somebody's figured that out, but we've decided it's worth it.
Yeah.
And all of the every single store, and like liquor stores, grocery stores, etc., will sell like all the schlocky Irish stuff, Irish foods. Obviously, they sell a lot of Guinness, they sell a lot of Irish whiskey at that time, etc. And yeah, so this is kind of like there's something about it. There's something about it. And the thing is, like, it's not inaccurate. Like almost every, person in America has some amount of like Irish
Hmm.
DNA or blood, or like however you want to say it. I myself, and like most of my ancestors are from Scotland and Ireland.
Hmm.
So there's something about it, but it's weird. Like it's almost difficult to quantify. Similar thing with Scottish culture, but I think not quite as much. I think not
Hmm.
quite as much. Although I think there were probably that did get a bump from Mel Gibson's Braveheart a little
Yeah, for
while
sure.
back. Yeah, but okay, so there's something about Irish culture, Irish history that is like that is simultaneously, when it's presented, especially kind of like in a North American context, is simultaneously like very kitsch,
Hmm.
but also somehow is compelling enough to kind of like hold on.
Hmm.
So here, I'll tell on myself for a minute. Um, I've only ever been to two concerts in my entire life.
Wow.
Um, I mean, you have to remember that I grew up like fundamentalist,
Yeah, that's true.
everything. So we didn't listen to rock music because if you play it backward, you can hear the words the demons are saying, which is a real thing that I was actually told. That's not just a joke. That's a real thing that I was told as a
But
kid.
probably if you play anything backwards, you can hear the words that the demons are saying. Because
Yes, I mean that's the thing.
why are you playing it backwards in the first
I
place?
don't know, and like, what did like, you know, did how did CDs mess with the devil's plans? Like, how do you play a CD backwards? I don't know. But anyway, okay, all right.
And
So
also, the biggest complicated thing is also because why do you listen to backwards when listening to it straightforward, you can already hear the demons speaking. So
also
why
that, also that,
also that?
like who was like, I'm gonna play this backwards?
Like
Yeah. Anyway,
when
okay.
I
So
listen to Megadeth backwards, I have all these weird things. Like, dude, just listen to it forward. You're good. Like you got enough
oh
demons there.
man, oh boy,
All right.
we
Okay.
really derailed this one.
All right.
Okay, so so I've only been to two concerts. One was, Dirt Poor Robins with you guys, like you and
Really? Wow.
yeah, like literally that's the only time in my life I've ever been in front of an actual rock band playing actual music. Yeah, and yeah, so horribly sheltered everything else here. But you have to also understand in my family, going to a concert meant you were going to the symphony.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so going to the concert literally meant you put on a tuxedo
Mm.
and you went to the symphony. And if I say I'm going to a concert, that is still what I mean.
Mm.
Like, I'm still a giant snob or whatever. But anyway, okay. So the only other time that I've been to a concert was when the band Celtic Woman came to my
Celtic
hometown
women? Is that
and
a
performed. Yeah, there's like a band or like a group
uh
called Celtic Women or Celtic Woman. But it's like it's a bunch of tall
Celtic
blonde
women?
ladies singing, vaguely Irish music, like vaguely
All right.
Irish music.
Yeah.
You get your obligatory "Oh Danny Boy" and everything else is kind of new agey and whatever. But uh my wife and I really like them, so we went. Like, I mean, this
It's a
would be
big
more
deal. It's a
embarrassing.
big deal for you.
This would be more embarrassing if I didn't own literally every album Enya has ever made. But anyway, that's a different conversation. It's a different conversation. So, all right. So I say all this to say, like, there's something about that, like the Celtic woman of it all, that is really kitsch and yet continues to remain like interesting or compelling on some level,
Mm.
enough that, like all kitsch things, like it like, there's got to be something to it, or people wouldn't still be
Yeah.
doing it, right? So, what I'd like to do in the next few Universal History videos will be to take a look at some things in the British Isles, because the other reason I'm scared to talk about this is because there's so much.
Yeah.
And
'Cause it's
really
the edge of the
there's
world, so there's got to be a lot.
exactly. But also, like, there is like this much stuff about other cultures, but this is my native language for one thing, so
Mm.
that makes it easier. But also, like, this is the thing I've dedicated my entire academic life to studying, really, is Anglo-Saxon and Saxon and medieval Celtic cultures. And so there's just like so much to choose from. It's really difficult to kind of know where to start. So what I thought we'd do today would be to start with a book which is sometimes called the Book of Invasions. The Book of Invasions. It is it's a work of, it's also called like the Book of the Conquest of Ireland, is literally what the Irish name for it means.
Hmm.
But it's an 11th century work of universal history.
Hmm.
And so here we're on pretty firm footing in terms of kind of what we've come to expect in terms of medieval universal history.
Yeah.
And what it tries to do is it tries to take the pagan history of Ireland, and specifically the lineage of the High Kings of Ireland, which is like the main source of kind of the pagan prehistory of Ireland. Tries to take that and merge it with the biblical and classical narratives. And so basically you get a sense of, well, it starts with Genesis. It starts with God made the heaven and the earth at the first, and he himself hath no beginning nor ending. That's the beginning of the book. So we find uh, uh, I'll read a little bit from the creation narrative here, actually, because it's kind of interesting to see how they interpreted certain things from the Genesis account. He made first the formless mass and the light of angels. That's the light. The let there be light. That's the angels.
Yeah.
Which is this is actually a common medieval debate, by the way. People, when were the angels created? Were they created on the first day, or were they created on the same day as the stars, the sun and the stars? So he made the formless man and the light of angels. He made firmament on the Monday. He made earth and seas on the Tuesday.
Did it
He
say
made
he made the formless man?
uh no, formless mass. I'm sorry,
Oh, I was like,
formless mass. But basically
yeah,
like
yeah,
a
yeah,
formless
the
mass of
chaos.
matter, right? That's then going to be shaped into things. No, formless man would have been insane. Yeah, that would have been crazy. Um he made the firmament on the Monday. He made the earth and the seas on the Tuesday. He made sun, moon, and the stars of heaven on the Wednesday. He made birds of the air and reptiles of the sea on the Thursday. He made beasts of the earth in general and Adam to rule over them on the Friday. Thereafter, God rested on the Saturday from the accomplishment of a new creation, but by no means from its governance. Thereafter, he gave the bailiffry, that is like the jurisdiction of heaven, to Lucifer with the 9 orders of the angels of heaven. He gave the bailiffry of earth to Adam and to Eve with her progeny. Thereafter, Lucifer sinned so that he was leader of a third of the host of angels. The king confined him with a third of the host of angels in his company in hell. And God said unto the foe of heaven, haughty is this Lucifer. Thereafter, Lucifer had envy against Adam, for he was assured that this would be given him, that is Adam, the filling of of heaven in his room. So this is a very common idea, by the way, that you run into in I can't remember if I read this already in our series from the Anglo-Saxon Genesis, but there is a very common kind of a thing where you have uh, this idea that the humanity is created or humanity's destiny is to take the place of the angels that
Yeah.
fell. And this is implicit, by the way, even in the book of Revelation. Like you have 4 and 20 elders because that's a third of the number, the traditional number of the divine council, right? So, um, let's see. So thereafter Lucifer had envy against Adam, for he was assured that this would be given to Adam, the filling of heaven in his room, or that is his place of jurisdiction. Wherefore he came in the form of a serpent and persuaded Adam and Eve to sin in the manner of eating the apple from the forbidden tree. Wherefore Adam was expelled from paradise into common earth. So, uh, most of this is the way, happens the way that we would expect it to happen. But there are some kind of additional details that are basically like nothing unusual for the Middle Ages here, but they are kind of interesting glosses on the Genesis text.
Yeah.
So the story goes on to trace the lineage of the Gaelic peoples through the line of Noah. So you have Japheth, of course, being in the Genesis account and in the kind of medieval understanding, Japheth is the father of the medieval of like medieval Europe,
Yeah, it's
essentially,
the father of
the
Europe.
Indo-European peoples. And so it says that Magog, the son of Japheth, of his progeny are the peoples who came to Ireland before the Gadi, to wit, the Partholonians, and it goes on and lists a bunch of tribe names, including the progeny, it says, of Nemed, of the Firbolg, and the Tuat Dedanin, which are these are important groups of essentially what we now think of as fairies that we'll come back to in a minute.
So
So
descendants of Magog.
they're descendants of Magog. So I thought you would like that.
Well, yeah, I do like that,
Yeah.
obviously.
So yeah, they're descendants of Magog. So Magog is, of course, a giant.
Yeah.
He's a monster, he's a giant. There's kind of different how do I say this? There's like sort of different Magog uh legends, and sometimes it's like Gog and Magog are like two monsters and giants. Obviously they're sort of like the names of countries, on the edge of the world. I mean, we've talked about this in a previous
Yeah.
video. It's been a minute though, so maybe people should
Yeah.
go back and revisit that.
Sometimes they're kind of cannibal
Right.
hybrid type monsters that live on the edge of the world. That they're the people that
Alexander locked
Alexander the
out.
Great locked out with the
Yeah.
gates of So
Well, in another legend, they came to the island of Albion,
yeah.
that is the island of Britain, and we're kind of actually the first people to settle there. And so, for instance, like the history of the kings of Britain and the Brutus legend, which we've talked about way back at the very beginning of this series, and we are going to revisit that stuff. But in the Brutus legend, that's who Brutus fights. Like basically, they fight the giants when they come to the island, right? So,
That's
um,
interesting that the Irish or the Gaelic see themselves as descendants of Magog. So it's like the idea that they're the ones who were chased out of the
So
beast.
this is going to get even more interesting in a certain way. So to kind of summarize this, the Book of Invasions, or the Book of the Invasions of Ireland, basically identifies six major waves of invasions, right? And so in the way that same way that we talked about Ethiopia being kind of like the symbolism of the nest, right? The thing that's made of leftovers, right? Of and then sort of, but then it kind of collects things and becomes a place where life can be sheltered.
Mhm.
Ireland is similarly Ireland is similarly a it's a it's a catch-all. It's on
Yeah.
the end. It's a sort of the it doesn't quite have the same nest imagery that Ethiopia has, but it does have the sense of being, the literally the edge of the world. I mean, it is the edge of the world for most of the history of medieval Europe, that you can't go any farther west than Ireland.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's why, there are some legends that find themselves there and you don't know why. Like a good example is the St. Christopher legend. So
Yeah.
St. Christopher is a dog-headed man in the east, and then he's usually a giant in the west, but then in Ireland, for some reason, they caught that. Like they have these legends of
Yeah.
St. Christopher as a dog-headed man.
Even Gog and Magog, like they're supposed to be off in the east, shut out by Alexander's gates, but then they show up in the British Isles. Like it's like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So so basically what happens what you have in the Book of Invasions is this idea that these groups keep invading the island of Ireland.
Hmm.
And when they invade, they usually wipe out the previous peoples, or the previous peoples are left there, but they kind of go into hiding.
Yeah.
And the previous peoples that are left there and go into hiding have the names or identities or culture that modern scholarship, like I'm talking about archaeology and history and things like that here, would associate with like this Stone Age culture or this Bronze Age culture or whatever, but also with the different pantheons of gods that are worshipped by that group of people.
Hmm.
And it's sort of like uh I mean, typically speaking, when you like if you drive a people out of the land, um, so you push them out, they go somewhere else, they take their gods with them.
Hmm.
And it's relatively unusual for the gods of a conquered people, or let's say like of four conquered peoples ago, to sort of like still hang around in the hills, right? But it's kind of like the idea is like in Ireland, there's nowhere else for them to go, right?
Because they're at the edge of the
They're
world.
already at the edge of the world. And so on an archaeological level, this is happening, but also you could say on the level of principalities and powers, right?
Mm.
This is also kind of happening. Like there's a reason that Ireland is so strongly associated. It's not the only place in the world, but it is probably the place in the Western, like, like the Anglosphere is probably the place most strongly associated with fairies.
Yeah, for sure.
And there is some aspect of fairies that are something like a splinter or a piece that's broken off of, or kind of like leftover hierarchies. Um, and I that's that is it's hard to like even say that out loud, because it's like, you
Yeah.
know,
But I mean,
but
it makes sense because that's how they function,
yeah,
because they're kind of like the jinn, right? We talked about this before because they're very ambiguous, and why would they want to like trick you? Like what the idea that principalities kind of want to get your attention or
right.
trick you and all of these things, it means that they have to be kind of wandering. They're
Right.
wandering in the desert. They're not attached to the right order.
If you read eyewitness accounts of fairy stories, or like fairy encounters, rather, eyewitness accounts of fairy encounters. These are people who were like walking along, usually in Ireland or Wales is where most of these things happen. And we'll talk about Wales in a future episode, I think. But people are so walking along and you meet a fairy, right? Very often it's like the bishop is walking along, or like a priest is walking along, and they meet a fairy. And the fairies are always concerned with the question of whether or not they can be saved,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right? And so there's like all kinds of like strange things, like where like the priest will or the bishop will say, well, can you say the Pater Noster? And like the fairy can't say our Father, right? He can't say that. And so then it's like, so by the way, the answer is always that can't be known until the day of judgment. That's always
Yeah,
the
yeah.
answer. Like, and so there is this sort of thing like where, and maybe some of this is tied to the idea that you also find in the legends of Jinn. By the way, right now I'm rereading for the upteenth time a wonderful novel called Declare by Tim Powers. You should read this at some point, because but it's all about Jin and also like Cold War spycraft and stuff. Anyway, great book, great book. Powers digs into Powers is an amazing. Actually, you should have him on the channel. He's an amazing. He's a Roman Catholic, amazing contemporary author.
Hmm.
Probably for my money, he's like the best current fiction author that we
Okay.
have. He's great. But anyway, he's got a great book about this, and but he's really deeply researched like all of these different legends about the Jinn and the fairies and so on, and then kind of incorporates them all into kind of this thing that makes a lot of
Hmm.
sense. But anyway, all that to say, in the legends of the fairies and the Jinn, one of the theories of where they come from is that they're basically like angels who only fell halfway,
Yeah.
or that they didn't join Lucifer's rebellion, but they didn't side with God either. So they're cast out of heaven, but they're not cast all the way down, right? So that's one kind of medieval theory about where fairies come from. There also seems to be something though, like as I was saying, like though they're the sort of the remnant, or like a sort of a fractal, like a piece that's broken off of an older hierarchy.
Yeah.
And Ireland just sort of collects these things,
Yeah.
right? Collects these hierarchies, collects these stories of invasions.
And so this is important. I think this at this little point that you made is really important for people to understand kind of how it works. And so how it works is that there are traces of this at every level, right? So you have a story, like you said, of the idea of these gods that have been kind of chased away, that they are, in ambiguous spaces, they haunt, places that aren't clear, and that they're, or like we saw in Dante, like we do actually have in Dante a place in hell where these ambiguous spirits are, where they didn't take
Yeah.
they didn't take position in the war between heaven and hell, and then that will then reflect itself at the lower level. So like Richard said, it also means that there is a ancient civilization that was there that was maybe broken up, and the residues of that were not fully assimilated into the next civilization, and therefore it leaves these little parts of stories, parts of rituals, maybe superstitions, all these types of behaviors and things that are actually residues from a world that is now over, but that are still kind of haunting the margin of a story. So then you can have that at several layers of that, like you said, and then you end up with these odd spaces of remainder that are part of your culture. And so when the archaeologist and the modern historian, they just see that level. So they'll say, oh, this weird story is a trace of an older story that the people that were there before, and it's not really well integrated into the new mythology.
Right.
And the answer is yes.
Yes.
But
That's
it also means that the principalities that were ruling over those people, they are also kind of there but not there, that
right.
they still affect the world, but in an indirect way.
Yeah,
So
I mean that's exactly it. Like that whole, well, this is probably just a leave over from the previous civilization. That is what a fairy is. Like, and of course, like when people historically came across those, like the burial mounds from those people, they would say, "Oh, that's a she mound," right? That's the Irish word for fairy. It's a much better word than fairy, by the way. Fairy comes from the French. You guys know how I feel. No, I'm kidding. Um, just
But
but
I want to press one last
yeah,
thing, just because I think it's really important. So it's like I know it's hard because we talk about these things and sometimes they just sound just mythological.
right.
They are, but it's important to understand that, like when, for example, people build computer systems, this is a good example.
Oh
It's
yeah,
like they create a program, like they create a language, or they create how do you call it, like a platform for something to run on, and then if they want to now add another platform, sometimes they can't completely destroy the one that was underneath. They try to like press it down, right? And so where you had Windows running on DOS, and then DOS is like this weird thing that is kind of lingering in the background that you don't know, but sometimes the effect of DOS would peek itself into windows, and then you'd have all these weird things happen because it's basically running layers of things running on top of each other.
Yeah.
And so this idea of this problem of how to create a new world without like on a place that already exists creates these residues that will infect sometimes the systems that are built on top of it. So it's not just like we're just not just talking about like weird mythological stories. Like this is actually how you build systems of meaning, and that this is how it works.
So in the Book of Invasions, the first people to settle in Ireland before the flood of Noah, is a woman and the people with her who come from Egypt. Um, I know you just hate it when stuff comes from Egypt, but here we are. Um, the, the reason we haven't done a universal history of Egypt yet, you guys, is because Jonathan's always like 19th century Egyptologist in the,
I know.
anyway, it's
I
a
just,
it's
I
a but we
but
are going to do it at some
we
point
need to
because
do it. The
it's
symbolism of Egypt is important in the Bible and in a lot of
but
cultures.
also like the symbolism of Egyptology, like the way that just like took over the
Yeah.
British cultural consciousness for 100 years. I mean, is really crazy. But anyway, okay. So they come from Egypt with a great plan for perpetuating civilization here, 50 women and 3 men. And uh depending on the story that you read, the accounts here is that it's just that's kind of a lot of women, and so the first 2 men kill themselves.
They just tire
Kill
themselves
themselves.
out.
And the third man, a guy named Fintan, he throws himself into the sea. And when he throws himself into the sea, he changes into a salmon. There's a lot of shape shifting
Mhm.
in Celtic myth, and turning yourself into a salmon is one of the main things that you would turn yourself into. He turns himself into a salmon and then later on into a bird and so on and so on. And it's because of this that Fintan survives the great flood. He survives the flood of Noah.
Mhm.
Not only does he survive the flood of Noah, but he survives every single successive invasion, like every single successive generation. And he's the sort of the one who tells about it all, like in kind of the idea, when he, is able to tell the story to the first High King of Ireland of all the generations that came before, right?
Mhm.
And so all the way back, like even there's this idea of like a residue from before the flood,
Mm.
right?
Wow.
Which is something that shows up in a lot of world cultures, right? Obviously, it's there in Gilgamesh and it's there in other things, but this idea of a residue before the flood, like something like a seed of something that survives before the flood, like even it's difficult now in a time and an age where people are so widely divorced from their food to understand how incredibly important the salmon were, not just for like so that people could live and eat in the in ancient Britain and in Ireland, but also the way that the salmon um the place that it took in the sort of the mythological consciousness, right? As the thing that goes out and returns, right? And the thing that, like at the salmon the salmon come back to the river,
Yeah, it's
like,
a
and
cycle.
they always home
Participate in
back
the
to the place that
cycle.
they're from. They always home back to the place they're from. They come back to the river they're in to spawn and then to die, right? And there's like out of that death this new life is going to come. So it's and somehow like this figure of Fintan is related to that. And there are other really similar figures in later Irish myths that are basically the same idea, like this residue or this guy that's left over from a previous age. He's usually got shape-shifting powers. He's usually a poet, and he's able to remember the stories of what happened before because he was actually there.
Yeah.
So then the next group that come along are the Partholons, and you're gonna really enjoy this. So they basically came from either like Sicily or maybe Greece.
Uh-huh.
And actually most of the early groups are usually said to have come from Greece or Egypt or somewhere in the old kind of the biblical
Mhm.
world.
Yeah.
And they do a bunch of different things. They are the ones who originate cattle husbandry. They're the first people to like keep cattle in Ireland, which becomes like the main thing that you do in Ireland later on. In fact, the great Irish epic, basically the Irish Iliad, if you will, is called the Cattle Raid of Cooley. And we were going to talk about it at some point because it was one of my favorite things to read as a kid. Like it's one of those books somebody gave me as a kid, probably because they didn't know what was in it. And then as a kid, I read this and I was like, "Oh boy, this is good
Pretty
stuff."
spicy.
Yeah, it's pretty spicy. Um, they also originate cooking, drinking, and dueling. Three things, as everybody knows, the Irish love. Um, some stereotypes are really old. I don't know what to say. So they are eventually either wiped out by a plague or by an invasion of dog-headed apes.
All right.
So I don't have a lot more to tell you about that right now, but I thought that was a very little interesting
Yeah,
note.
it definitely is interesting. There is a whole connection between the dog-headed man and also the dog-headed apes. And, this is one of the theories, obviously, of the modern type scholars. They talk about how the dog-headed man are basically just are baboons, really. Um,
I
and
mean,
people's encounter with baboons. I think it's boring. It's a
I,
boring.
I, I mean, my main problem with that is like you act like nobody in the ancient world ever saw a monkey.
Yeah.
Like, like half of the Roman Empire was in Africa, man. Like people saw baboons. Like,
Yeah.
anyway. So then the next wave or the next invasion is by a guy named Nemed, who also comes from Greece with his four sons. There's a whole kind of an interesting thing about them. Let's see if I can find this. Several of them basically man, the reason I'm paused people is because there's so many weird things here. I'm like they're trying to all get out of my mouth at once, and it's a little hard to prioritize. So he comes from Greece with his four sons. A bunch of his sons actually drown trying to seize a tower of gold in the sea. So there's like this undersea kingdom and a tower of gold and everything. I think we'll come back to this. And Nemeth is the one who clears the plains and builds the royal forts. So
Hmm.
basically, you have kind of these iterative things that explain why Irish culture is the way that it is. In the Middle Ages, Irish culture was basically uh, organized as was much of the culture of Northern Europe, organized around like these networks of hill forts.
Hmm.
And then eventually those are where the monasteries will be built later on. And so we got cattle husbandry, cooking, drinking, dueling. We get the network of forts that comes, is established by the successive generation. And basically they come into conflict with this group known as the Formorians. Now, the Formorians are not one of the six traditional invasions, but they seem to be sort of like basically the Irish or the Celtic equivalent of like Titans or the giants.
Okay.
Right? They're these really monstrous kind of spirits that, like chthonic spirits that have to do with the like uncontrolled nature, something like that. And so they mostly get killed. About 30 of them flee back to Greece, and there's this idea later on that the next group that comes, which will be the Firbolg, that they're going to be, basically they're the survivors of those guys, and they're coming back, trying to take back their own.
Take revenge or take
So
back.
this is the fourth invasion. These guys also come from Greece, where they've been slaves. That might be what the word Firbolg means. Might mean something like it's like the men of pouches or the men of breeches,
Hmm.
but also there's this. I mean, this word bolg. Uh, um, Funnily enough, same word in Dante, like the Bolgia in Circle 8 of Inferno, right? This
Pocket.
is an old Indo-European root that means like sw something is swollen.
Hmm.
And so it could also have but like it can have the idea of like a pocket or a pouch or like some, kind of compartment that swells out. Um, it might also, in the case of the Firbolg, it might have something to do with them being like swollen with rage. That's
Hmm.
a pretty that's one possible etymology. There are some people that thought they're actually related to like the Belgae, like the Belgians, and maybe there's a relationship between the two of them there.
The
But in any
Belgians are
case,
they're swollen with rage all the time. It's just you don't know.
see, everybody has
Joking.
somebody else they joke. The English pick on the French apparently
Pick
pick
on
on
the
the
Belgians.
Belgians. I
That's
dig
right.
it. Okay, that's cool. All right, so yeah, so they come and they divide Ireland. They're the ones who divided Ireland into the traditional fifths. And the interesting thing about them is that the Firbolg don't fight against the Fomorians. In fact, they seem to fight alongside them later on. they
Mhm.
seem to make some kind of rapprochement with the like these monstrous nature spirits.
Mm.
So the next group that comes and invades Ireland after the Fir Bolg is and these are the ones who are the most probably well known would be the Tuatha De Danann, and they we're told unlike the one unlike everybody else who comes from like Greece or Egypt or whatever, we're told that they come from the north of the world,
Mm.
um and that they're and they're experts in magic. Like these are the fairies. These are the old Celtic gods. That's basically who they are. The most, Lug being like the main, their main champion, who is also like the main Celtic war god, right?
Yeah.
And so they come and they show up, and there's a whole bunch of battles with the Fir Bolg and the Fomorians, and basically eventually the Tuatha De Danann win all of these battles, drive everybody else, and take over Ireland. And these are the sort of like the most strongly sort of the group that we most strongly associate with fairy traditions later, for a reason I'll explain in a moment. But I mean, one of the things that's really interesting to me is this idea that gets developed kind of in parallel, gets developed in Celtic, like British Celtic, like in other words, like Welsh
Hmm.
uh, lore, is the idea of like the great treasures of the land.
Hmm.
So the Tuatha De Danann have four great treasures. And then later on, there are, the things develop into there are 12 treasures of the 12 treasures of the island of Britain, later on, this idea that Merlin or somebody else like cultivates these 12 treasures. And the treasures are always items that are important to kind of like the Bronze Age or like early Iron Age civilization in some way.
Hmm.
Um, so I mean, as for an example, the four treasures of the Tuatha De Danann are the Stone of Fall, and I'm not a Celticist, so if I'm mispronouncing some of these old Irish words, everybody, you're gonna have to forgive me. I'm sure I know somebody out there, Martin Shaw, if nobody else will correct me later. But so this is the Stone of Fall is the stone that cries out beneath the king who takes the sovereignty of Ireland, right? And so it's like, and this is something that shows up again in lots of like even today, like the Blarney Stone, right? You have this idea like there's this sort of like this magical stone which might be related to some like the later Grail stuff and the connection between the Grail and the Stone of Preparation in Jerusalem, which we talked about earlier in the series. But the stone that cries out beneath the king who takes Ireland, like whoever's the High King, right? And so this it's how you sort of know. Um, there's the um, and each of these treasures, there are four treasures. Each of the treasures comes from these four legendary islands called the Four Jewels that are like supposed to be in the very north of the world.
Hmm.
So historians might try to like tie that to like the Hebrides or something like that. It doesn't really matter for our purposes, like for mythological purposes, but the idea that there are these four islands and each of these four islands has this beautiful like city on it, and the Tuatha De Danann as powerful magicians or gods or whatever they are, that when they come to Ireland, they come, by the way, they don't arrive on ships, they arrive on burning clouds.
Mm.
Right. And invade the island, and they bring with them um each of these four they bring with them each of these four treasures, one from each of the islands. So there's the Stone of Fall, there's the Spear of Lug. This is basically, just an invincible weapon. There's also a sword. No one ever escapes from it once it is drawn from its sheath. Nobody can resist it. And it glows like a bright torch, like it's a magic sword. Probably, close to the original magic sword, basically.
Mm.
I mean, like as the idea of like a magical sword that shines with light and that's completely irresistible. There's a ton of other stuff downstream from this, like Caliburn or Excalibur, King Arthur's sword, and so on. Like there's a ton of uh examples of this all the way down to Tolkien, right? But this idea of like a blade that shines brightly and that nothing can resist is a very Celtic idea. And then there's also a cauldron, a magical cauldron, which basically, produces unlimited amounts of food and drink. Like this, and this is like about half the magical items are that kind of thing, like a horn of plenty or like a
Yeah.
magical cauldron or something like that. Nowadays
So a
that's maybe
stone, a cauldron, a sword, and
and a spear.
a spear.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, very, I mean, like very evocative, very kind of, I don't know what the word for this is, but like the fundamental things that you need for civilization. That's the idea here, right? Because the conflict between the Tuat Don and the Fomorians is something like the conflict between the gods of civilization versus the god, like the chthonic,
Yeah,
it's like the Olympians versus the Titans,
yeah.
right? It's that kind of a thing. And or the Olympians versus the Giants. It's that kind of a thing. And the interesting thing is that the Irish trace themselves to the people who sided with the monsters, which is, I think, pretty awesome. So the Fear Bolg who fight along with the Fomorians against the Tuatha De Danann, and then later on the final group that comes, and this is the group that the Irish, the medieval Irish, trace themselves back to, is the Sons of Mill or the Milesians. And the Sons of Mill or the Milesians, they come from Spain. This is not like an accident, by the way. Spain was Celtic
Yeah.
during the ancient world. It was Celtic. Everybody remembered that, by the way. Um, uh, so he shows up. So the Sons of Mill, they show up in Ireland. There's a tons of amazing stories. There's a ton of amazing stories here, which we will maybe go into in a kind of a future thing. There's a bunch of stories that I want to kind of abstract it, but most of the time, medieval Irish writing is like it's just like sometimes just a wall of names and then like
Hmm.
these little like excerpts of story or these long poems, things like that. And so it's rather hard reading for modern people. And so what I want to
Like
do
reading
is
numbers in the Bible.
it's like that but worse,
Yeah.
maybe only because I grew up with numbers, like, and I
Yeah,
didn't
exactly.
grow up with this, and so I'm used to it, but yeah, it's like these, like, here's a wall of names that you can't pronounce anyway,
Mm.
and then somewhere at the end of that wall of names you get these little like vignettes of like weird things that happen, like um the Tuatha De Danann, when the Milesians are coming to Ireland, and they're basically coming because they're coming for a good Irish reason to do anything, which is revenge, right? And so they're headed towards Ireland, and the Tuatha De Danann, like, they disguise the land to make it look like a pig swimming in the ocean, and there's all this other stuff. Eventually they fight these battles. And the Tuatha De Danann, they're the ones who basically invent druidic magic and
Yeah.
like druidic
Okay.
practice and things, by the way. And so they fight some battles, and then the Tuatha De Danann say, we'd like a 3-day ceasefire. And the Milesians say, fine. They agree to it. And so they say, and you have to wait like a certain number of hours off the coast in a boat, right? And then while they're waiting off the coast in the boat for 3 days, the Tuatha De Danann call up all these storms and try to kill them. But then the main harper of the Milesians, he sings a song that calms the storm, right? And so then the Tuatha De Danann are like, all right, well, we can't really, we better broker peace. So they say, we'll divide the land between us.
Hmm.
And the the Harper, uh I think his name is Aramon, but that might be wrong. I can't remember right now. But um he they all look to him and they say, well, he's the smartest guy, so he can divide the land. And the idea is, again, this guy is like a sort of a bard in the Celtic tradition, right? And so they say, we can you can divide the land fairly between us. And so it's got to be exactly even. You will take half, and they'll take half.
Hmm.
And he says, yeah, no problem at all. For the Milesians, they can have the upper world, and the Tuatha De Danann can have the underworld. It's half and half. And so there's like a little bit of trickery there. And so then the Tuatha De Danann all go down into, like, they go into the sea, the She Mounds. They go into the earth. They go
Oh,
into
great.
the other world.
Uh-huh.
And that sort of like explains why is Ireland the way that it is now, right? Is that and so again, there's something interesting to me about the Tuatha De Danann being associated so strongly with civilization
Yeah.
and the sort of like the arts of civilization, right? What are the things that you need to found uh a civilization in the Middle Ages? Well, you need stones and you need a king, and like the idea of a stone of kingship, those two things go together because who rules over the city, right? And then you need weapons, and you need the ability to like provide for everybody,
Yeah.
feed everybody, right? So even in their treasures, like these are the fundamental treasures of civilization. But then but then basically they get like civilization stolen from them by this trick, and then
Mhm.
they have to go down. They have to go into the other world.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, it's interesting because in some ways, this is the duality of civilization, I think, is being represented very well here, right? We have the same situation in the story of Cain, which is it's reversed, but it's that Cain gets ejected and is becomes a wanderer, and then because of that, then he found the city. And so you have this image, right, in a lot of mythology, that the idea of Hephaestus or these underworld gods that are the origin of technology and of weapons and all of this stuff. So, the duality of it might seem contradictory, and in some ways it is, but it's contradictory in the sense that there's a relationship between, you could say, the underworld, the world of death, and civilization, because they play off each other, right? They kind of they act as, civilization is a way to protect ourselves from that world. And so it's not surprising that you find this relationship in stories like that as well.
Yeah. So there's a lot of, I mean, this particular work, the Book of Invasions, which you can find parts of online. It's kind of hard to find a full English translation, but is full of just very strange, wonderful things that we haven't even talked about today because it's like it's too much. But I will try to for our next video, what I'm going to try to do is to kind of excerpt these, like some vignettes, so you get so people get a sense of the storytelling style and things like that. Actually, a lot of it is just poetry. It's about this guy and how famous his cows were, and stuff like that. So it's like this sort of thing maybe would be more important to you if you would, like if you like cattle, if that was your whole life,
Yeah.
But
So what is the
there's some.
interaction between the different, so is there this idea that all of these people, like the ape dog-headed apes and stuff like that they're still kind of lingering?
Yeah, I mean, so this is the thing, like some of these earlier groups, like the Fearbull, they'll come back later on in like the
Yeah.
Ulster cycle, which is like again, that's one of the big main Irish mythological cycles. Like, so a lot of these groups will come back, and throughout later Irish and earlier Irish stories, like you come across people who were like, and it's this very kind of common thing. One of the main stories that I want to look at in our series on Ireland is going to be a book that's sometimes called the Colloquy of the Ancients. This is a hugely important work of universal history. Basically, it's a book that explains the place names in Ireland, why the places in Ireland are called what they are.
Mm.
But actually, it's a story about St. Patrick meeting and baptizing the last giant, and then he travels around with him, and the giant tells the stories of like, hey, what about this great, and by the way, I mean, this is really sad. I had an extensive book of notes on the Colloquy of the Ancients that I've been studying for months and months and months, and it got left out in the rain and completely
Oh,
ruined,
no.
and I was so sad. But anyway, it's okay. I have most of it in my mind. But I'm working on reconstructing my outline for those videos. But we'll probably spend more than one on it because it's got so many important details about kind of like early Indo-European civilization, and so many important details about how did Christians in Ireland, where they encountered this stuff in kind of a different way. Like we've talked about all along, like there's always what C.S. Lewis referred to as like a Christian right and a Christian left,
Yeah.
and the left is always trying to get rid of things, right? So that's actually the more extreme rigorists who are trying to like purge all the paganism and
Yeah.
everything, and then there's a right that's like, no, there's good stuff that we need to hang on to here.
Great.
And most of the Irish fell into the second category.
Mm.
And so they're always trying to figure out how to save things, but this is actually, it's dealt with explicitly in the story. We'll come back to this, but I'll just tease it. In the story, St. Patrick, everybody knows St. Patrick has two guardian angels, by the way. Like maybe the rest of us only rate the one, But Patrick of Ireland, the salmon of heaven, as he's called, he has two guardian angels. By the way, this is awesome epithet. But anyway, um, and so he's sitting there and he's listening to basically the last Irish hero, the last Irish giant, right? Telling, and he saw these guys. There's two of them. He saw them coming towards him, like with a cloud of demons over them. So
Whoa.
that, like, he baptizes them, and all the demons go away, and then they sit down to have dinner, and he says, tell me about, like, what was the greatest horse you ever saw, or who had the best hounds back in the old days, and all these different things. And then at some point, Patrick is like, maybe it's not good for me to think about these things because it's keeping me from prayer.
Uh-huh.
And so he prays about this, and his guardian angels come to him, and they basically tell him something to the effect of, "It's okay. All of the stuff in this that's harmful is going to be forgotten."
Wow.
Right. And so there's this idea that, like, the stuff that's, like, when it comes into contact with Christianity, the stuff in paganism that's like harmful or is detrimental, it's going to be sort of like, it'll be left behind.
Mm.
But the stuff of the remnant, and again, this is really like the main idea in Irish, you could say, like, Irish mythology or folklore, like, whatever. I don't know. There's not a good name for it, actually, but
Mm.
that's why we've been using universal history. But, like, the main idea in Irish universal history is the idea of the remnant from whatever came before, like
Yeah.
from before the flood, from the previous civilization, right? And the way that that remnant carries forward, and it carries forward through the medium of story, right? It carries forward. It's always poets. It's
Mm.
always poetry, right? That's the thing that you always, when you sit down with, like, one of these people, if you're ever, like, you run into, a man who can change into a salmon and then into a hawk, and he remembers the life before the flood, dear listener, like, if you ever run into this guy, the thing you need to ask for is the poetry.
Yeah.
Like, who had the seven greatest hounds in Ireland, right? Who had the best horse? Who had these are the kinds of things that you want to know. And so that's what the Colloquy of the Elders of Ireland is. By the way, um, Martin Shaw has done an amazing retelling of it on his Substack.
Wow.
We should really have him on to talk about it. But he's done an amazing retelling of it on the Substack. And of course, like, it's got this fancy, scholarly title, The Colloquy of the Ancients, which he's renamed to Old Men Talking,
Uh-huh.
which is what it is. It's just old men talking. And anyway, so
So I
uh
have a question about these.
yeah.
So do the Irish have a connection to Troy? Did they develop that story, or they only have this idea that they are connected to people before the flood?
So the Celts of Britain have an explicit connection to Troy. And that's the Brutus story that we've talked about in the
Right, of
past, and
course,
we'll
that's
we'll
right. Right.
revisit again. In at least in this particular book, at least in the invasions of Ireland, there is not an explicit connection to Troy.
Yeah.
There are other connections to, let's see here. There are other connections to kind of important locations in Italy, but or not Italy, in Western Europe, mainly Spain and Egypt and Greece. But I think the idea is that all of this is kind of like before that.
Yeah. And it's
Yeah.
interesting. I find it so interesting, the whole Egyptian connection, also because the the
The
Egypt really is considered in a lot of stories as the
is the
strange
oldest.
culture. Like,
But it's a strange culture, but it's also the oldest culture. Like,
yeah,
even
it's
the
the
yeah.
one that is the oldest. It's like it's somehow connected to, like, pre-flood world in that sense.
Right.
Like, it seems to be a continuation of the pre-flood world, but it also is the one that's least connected to all the others, and so it has this particular function. But interestingly enough, too, is that Irish monasticism seems to
Hmm.
Egyptian.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this will be something that we're going to talk about in a future video, but again, to just tease it a little bit, um, there are lots of indications that the Christianity that came to the British Isles, and particularly to Ireland, probably came from the Egyptian desert. And there's plausible historical reasons this could have happened, and there's, like, different archaeological evidences you can point to. This kind of gets us into the messy world of talking about Celtic Christianity, which, as I've said before, is kind of a wax nose. People like to shape it into whatever they want it to be.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so
yeah.
So a lot of times, it's just like shorthand for New Age. And the
Yeah.
thing that you have to
That's
understand,
what they do with Egypt too, by the
yeah,
way, which is
yeah, you're right. You're right.
that's right.
But the thing you have to understand about both Egyptian Christianity and then also Irish Christianity, um, and to me, this is as good evidence as anything that they're related, is that these are actually the most hardcore, most rigorous versions of Christianity
Mm,
that existed in the medieval world. So, I mean, as you know, most of the rigorous heresies basically come out of the Egyptian desert or, uh, Britain, Ireland, right? Like that's, it's like, I mean, Pelagianism, people forget Pelagianism was a rigorous heresy, right?
yeah.
And, but so was Donatism. Like they're two opposites, but they're both, founded in this rigorism. In Irish monasteries in the Middle Ages, okay, so just to get a sense of how hardcore they were. In Irish monasteries in the Middle Ages, a newly baptized monk. So like they baptize you and they make you a monk. So there's not just like a layperson like you and me living in the world, raising a family. A newly baptized monk, somebody who's dedicated their entire life to like living this ascetic experience, this life of holiness, was not even allowed to receive full communion in both kinds until 3 years after they've been baptized. So like they were like really hardcore, like took things really seriously. And I do plan like on doing 4 or 5 episodes, and we're going to talk about mythological stuff, and then we're going to talk about the conversion of the British Isles. And one of the things that we'll see is that this rigorism is one of the problems that the Celtic Church, or like you could call it the British Church or the Irish Church at that time. It's one of the problems that they ran into with the Augustinian mission when Saint Augustine of Canterbury comes to England, and he's there and he's got basically letters from the Pope that says we're gonna, let's reunify the whole church here in the British Isles. And the British bishops were not into it at all. And one of the reasons is that that British Christianity had kind of taken this sort of weird turn on its own, and it had to be sort of brought into line with the rest of the church. And this is symbolized by, the way they're doing the tonsure, and also like the day they're celebrating Easter on and things like this. And those things seem trivial to us in retrospect, but you got to think about, like, if you put yourself in the place of like a medieval pagan, right? In the 6th century, and you see there's two groups of people, and they're all like, this group over here cuts their hair one way, this group over here cuts their hair another way. And then you see that the rites of initiation are different because the Celtic Church got to doing baptism kind of weirdly. We'll
Hmm.
talk about this. Um, so the rites of initiation are different, and they don't even have the same feast days, right?
Hmm.
They're not even celebrating on the same day. You could be forgiven thinking these are two completely different religions. I mean,
Yeah.
why not? Like you don't know about all the like ecclesial politics and everything going on. And so anyway, so the Celtic Church actually got out of line. And this is the other thing that I'll say, is that you have to be very careful
Richard
idealizing.
taking the side of Rome in this question here. All
I
right.
mean, I'll just say up front, I do take this the Synod of Whitby did what it was supposed to do.
All right.
They needed to be like in line with the rest of the church as far as the date of Pascha and under obedience. And the Pope at the time was Pope Saint Gregory the Great, who's, you know, as bishops go, kind of
Not bad.
literally wrote the book on it, actually.
Not bad.
His book on pastoral care was like
Mm.
the handbook for how to be a pastor in the Middle Ages. So anyway, and of course he's very important in our own Orthodox tradition. He wrote he's the person who is credited for writing down the liturgy of the pre-sanctified gifts.
All right.
So and anyway, so all that to say, yeah, I'm mentioning all of this because it's important that we don't over idealize. uh I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm like 2 or 3 videos ahead. Even trying to talk about Ireland is like
Yeah.
it's just like, it's one of those things where symbolism happens. Like even trying to like make notes or make an outline for today's video was just like so impossible because I had all these little things kind of popping up as I was
Mm.
trying to write. But the thing that I would say is it's important not to, when it comes to Celtic Christianity and things like that, first of all, we know almost nothing about it,
Yeah.
because it didn't survive. And the second thing is that it's important not to over idealize these things, because there is a kind of, one of the things that comes with the symbolism of being on the edge is that you do tend towards certain kinds of extremes.
Yeah.
and those extremes are very often unhealthy. But what's beautiful about it, what's really wonderful about it is its capacity to preserve,
Hmm.
right? So that you can have these things like what's good from the previous ages, even the pagan past, like the things that are good about that have this capacity to be carried forward in a way that they weren't, for instance, in medieval France. You know,
Hmm.
to pick something that's at the center. You know,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah, because medieval civilization is mostly French. So
yeah.
yeah, give them their due there. So maybe that's a good place
I
to,
think so. I mean, it's a great
yeah.
introduction, and
Yeah, and I
can't wait
again,
to.
I apologize that this is so scattered. Like it is difficult to talk about. Like it is truly like there's partly because there's so much material and it's just so all over the place. It's just
Yeah.
all over the place. But what I want to do in future videos is we're going to do another video or two looking at some specific examples from Irish mythology. I want to and then look at the Colloquy of the Ancients and then introduce the Ulster cycle, which is like the big, again, this is like it's like the Irish Iliad.
Hmm.
Um, and then after that, we'll move on to looking at the kind of the ways that the British Isles were converted, starting with the which happened in like multiple times. Like,
Yeah.
Christianity, the religion's so nice they did it twice. Like, there's gonna be, there's like a Celtic conversion, and then there's multiple waves for the Anglo-Saxon conversion, and I want to look at all of that in a lot of detail. So that's probably going to be like 5 videos. So everybody just like, buckle in,
Rep
be
it.
patient. We're going to get to all of it. And hopefully by the end, you'll understand why I'm so terrified of talking about all of this stuff. But at the same time, like there's something about it that is really, like I said, I mean, there's something about even the kitsch. There's something about even the kitsch that's like really durable. And especially as Americans, when we so often don't have a sense of where we're from or who we are, I think that's part of the Celts as like the sort of the perpetual underdogs, and the only people who have ever, well, not the only people, but like one of the few people groups who have ever become famous through losing, like over and over again. But there's something about that took root here in American soil, like very early on. So my ancestors, I on one side of the family, it's sort of like English Quakers, and the other side of the family, it's like Scotch Irish. And the funny story that I'll end with is that when the Quakers were settling, they were settling too close to the Indians, the Native Americans. They were settling too close, and of course, Quakers are pacifists.
Yeah.
Native Americans, less
Mm.
so.
Not so
And
much.
so and so they said, what can we do about this? And so that's when you have these massive waves of immigration from Ireland and Scotland coming. And because what they figured out was we could get all of these Scotch Irish, there's a group called the Ulster Scots, who are basically Scots who settled in Ireland for a little while and then came over to the US. And that's my family, basically. And they basically said, we're going to get them to come and settle between us and the Native Americans, like between us, so that
So
they
they'll
can
be the
do all
ones
the
that can fight.
fighting
They can
and
go
we won't
fight.
have to deal with it. And so,
We can be
there is,
pacifist.
and
We just get other people to fight for us.
that's basically why Appalachia here in the US, like that's why it is what it is. That's why it exists. And we just got back from a trip through Appalachia, as a family. And the fun thing is that geologists will tell you that range of mountains is the same as the Scottish Highlands.
Hmm.
Like back when all the continents were all together, it's like one contiguous range of mountains that split off. And Appalachia is the place in the United States where you can still run into fairies.
Well,
So
that is the best place to finish for sure.
so I'm gonna stop right there.
All right, everyone. And so get ready. We're gonna have several episodes of the Universal History of Ireland. I am definitely already
It's gonna be
excited, looking
crazy,
forward to it.
guys. It's gonna be crazy.
All right, everyone. So it was wonderful. Thanks, Richard, again. Thanks for taking us on these trips. I love it, and I know everybody else does. So thanks a lot.
Yeah.